Possibility of hail and thunder in places, with the central and southern part of England most likely affected by those heaviest downpours. But where we get some sunshine, particularly towards the southeast, 22 Celsius, high teens elsewhere. Showers continue for a time on Thursday evening, and really it's a showery picture on Friday as well, with some sunshine in between. But the showers fade away eventually through the weekend, and next week looks drier. Bye-bye.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the day's big issue that we should be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table, and I'm not going to cancel anybody for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is writer and former media advisor to the Labour Party, Scarlett Maguire, and here's what we've got coming up on the show. The NATO summit begins with Russia's growing threat topping the agenda. It comes as CCTV footage is released of the deadly Russian attack on a Ukraine shopping centre. Meanwhile, the US president says America will boost its military presence in Europe. I'll be speaking to a former security advisor to President Trump. Plus, was the toppling of a slave trader statue a criminal act or an expression of human rights? The Court of Appeal is today due to decide. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you want to get off your chest? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet the programme @GBNews. First, though, it's time for the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon. It is 2 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members. The door for that was opened after Turkey withdrew its objections. Meanwhile, the US has announced plans to boost its military presence across Europe in response to the changing threat. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision to invite Finland and Sweden demonstrate its door remains open. He said the alliance is being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. we will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says the government has been getting its defence policy wrong for years.
The Tory government has been cutting defence for 10 years now. And despite what they said in 2019 at election time, they're planning to cut 10,000 more from our armed forces. Now, we, the Labour Party, have always put the defence of our nation first and called on them to halt that further cut. What I want to see now is a reboot in light of what's happened in the Ukraine. I want to see the government come forward with a review, and that has to include spending, because they've obviously got it wrong over a number of years now, and I think they're beginning to recognise that.
At Prime Minister's questions, Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner challenged the government for losing 2 by-elections in one day last week, and she and Dominic Raab deputised in the Commons.
It's no wonder that the Prime Minister has fled the country and left the honourable member to carry the can. The people of Wakefield and Tiverton held their own vote of no confidence. The Prime Minister isn't just losing the room, Mr. Speaker, he's losing the country. But instead of showing some humility, he intends to limp on until the 2030s. So does he think the Cabinet will prop him up for this long?
Deputy Prime Minister. I thank the Right Honourable Lady. I gently point out to her that we want this Prime Minister to go on a lot longer than she wants the leader of the Labour Party to go on.
A package of quotas and tariffs on steel imports is being extended by 2 years, despite breaching Britain's legal obligations under the World Trade Organization. The International Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, says it's justified to safeguard Britain's economy against energy market and supply chain disruptions.
We obviously stand ready to take up any concerns that WTO members may have on our decision, but I am absolutely certain that it is the right decision in order to ensure that we avoid as much harm or risk of injury to our steel producers as we can.
A 29-year-old man has been remanded in custody after appearing in court charged with the murder of Zara Alina. The aspiring lawyer died on Sunday after suffering serious head injuries in Ilford in East London. Well, our reporter Alice Porter is at Thames Magistrate Court and we can find out more. Alice, just give us the update.
Hi there. 29-year-old Jordan McSweeney appeared dressed in a grey tracksuit in court today. He's been charged with the murder of Zara Alina. He's also been charged with attempted rape and also been charged with robbery. The court heard that her bag was stolen with keys in it and her mobile phone as well. Mr. McSweeney spoke just to confirm his name and address in Dagenham. He's been remanded in custody and at the Old Bailey on Friday. His bail hearing will be taking place.
Alice Porter, our reporter outside Thames Magistrates Court. Thank you very much. Now, climate advisors are warning there is a shocking gap in government efforts to ensure homes are better insulated in the face of soaring energy bills. The Climate Change Committee's latest report calls for the government to consider increased funding for energy efficiency in fuel-poor homes. Its chief executive said the installation of insulation measures fell off a cliff a decade ago. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have paid tribute to Dame Deborah James, describing her as an inspirational and unfalteringly brave woman whose legacy will live on. The podcaster, known as Bowel Babe, died yesterday, aged 40, 5.5 years after being diagnosed with incurable bowel cancer. Donations to the fund she set up for cancer research have now hit £6.8 million. Speaking on her podcast, Dame Deborah convinced listener Margaret Muttard to check out her symptoms. Margaret was then diagnosed, treated and survived bowel cancer.
I was messaging her, and she was messaging back. She had lots of followers, but she was just so kind and so sweet, and was giving me advice when I was in hospital, saying, what was your, what was the size of your tumour? And actually, when we met up, she was so lovely. She was like, come in the picture, let's take a selfie. And she was so sweet. We were comparing sort of tumour sizes. She was like, oh, mine was 6.5 centimetres. And I was like, oh, God, mine was 7. And the one thing she said was that I am so pleased that you are the reason why I do this work, because you are an early stage survivor.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to We Need to Talk About.
More NATO. The message is clear. In 2022, a delicate balance was shattered. The West, once engaged in grueling conflict in the Middle East, fighting an ideology many miles away, now faces a threat from within the same continent. The country that armed the forces in places like Iraq and Syria that the West were trying to repress has turned its attentions to the nation next door, taking stock perhaps from the shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan and limp-wristed approach to Beijing. The West, Putin calculated, is in retreat. More NATO probably won't save Ukraine, and so attention is turning towards risk within its own borders. The tactical slow dance with Putin, taking care not to put a single boot inside his war zone, has not subdued his aggressions. The focus is to rearm now on NATO's own turf. Yet as Boris Johnson implores allies to tool up, reports that Downing Street furiously cut a line from Defence Secretary Ben Wallace's speech slamming the current target of 2.3% as outdated, exposes a country listing under the weight of pandemic spending, something Putin priced in as he inflicts food and energy crises across the globe. So the key question facing NATO today is what takes precedence, national self-interest or the collective effort? The latter may be the only way to protect the former. And the answer is in who can see the furthest ahead, Russia or us. Well, the NATO summit in Madrid is well underway. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, has sent this report from the summit.
Well, the NATO summit's well underway here in Madrid, probably the most important NATO summit that we've seen in decades, given the raging war in Ukraine, the escalation, frankly, that we've seen in that conflict this week with that missile attack on a shopping mall in Ukraine. And it is notable that lots of the rhetoric that we've seen from NATO leaders has hardened in recent days. Even Emmanuel Macron, the French president, someone who's been accused of being relatively soft on all of this, is insistent that Ukraine needs to win this war, that it must win this war. But the question for Ukrainians, and I'm speaking to one Ukrainian MP who's actually in Madrid today, his point that it's all very well and good hearing strong words. What's needed is actions. Clearly the Ukrainians are still pretty desperate for more weapons. They welcome the news that Finland and Sweden have now had their path cleared after Turkey lifted their objections to joining NATO. But they're also asking, well, why can't Ukraine join NATO? And there are questions about whether further sanctions could potentially help limit the ability of Russia to make munitions back home. But in the end, it is all really quite difficult stuff. I think the most notable thing we'll probably get from this summit is a commitment to increase NATO's presence, particularly in Eastern Europe. We know that the Rapid Defence Force is essentially going to increase maybe tenfold from around 30,000 to 300,000 troops. That is a notable increase. And that means, frankly, a lot of British troops involved in all of this as well that could be put on or placed in Eastern European countries as effectively kind of the front line of NATO, if you like. But many within Whitehall, many within the Ministry of Defence say, well, that means more money for Britain's armed forces. And we've seen a bit of a battle, actually, in recent days between the Ministry of Defence, Number 10 and the Treasury about defence spending. There had been suggestions that Number 10 may have been in favour of increasing defence spending quite substantially in the years to come. It's something the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has made clear he really wants to see. The Treasury seemed pretty reserved about all of this, suggesting where is the money going to come from in a cost of living crisis. And frankly, I do think we're going to see this kind of argument play out about whether defence spending should increase substantially in Britain, whether the Army and the Navy and the Air Force need to increase their numbers substantially as well, given the threat from Russia, and frankly where that money is going to come from. So there is a bit of a bitter battle back home during this NATO summit, and that is a battle I think that will carry on, given the agreement, at least within the UK government and clearly among NATO leaders, that Russia really is now a very potent and imminent threat.
Well, let's speak with Gwydion Prince from the London School of Economics, who's a former advisor to the Ministry of Defence and NATO. Gwydion, fantastic to have you back on the programme. More money, more NATO, but is it all posturing? Is this really going to make a difference?
Well, it better not be, Alex. And to pick up on the point that Darren was just making, of course we will pay, because we always pay for a simple reason, which is that defence expenditures are the only budget line in any democratic government that are not under the control of any government minister, including the Prime Minister. The person who controls the size of our defence budget is our enemy. And our choice is whether we are going to now follow through and strengthen deterrence in the ways that were being described by Stoltenberg and then just then by Darren, or whether we are going to dilly-dally and then find ourselves confronted with a situation where we're on the back foot and when we're going to have then to pay a lot more money in much worse circumstance.
We're talking about being on the back foot. It's interesting that some of the latest lines coming out of that NATO summit regard China, who hasn't really been at the forefront of discussion when it comes to defence for a number of years, but people increasingly worried about their Belt and Road Initiative and possible acts of aggression coming from there. Are we too late to this issue, do you think?
No, not at all. But the link with China is quite crucial. The Chinese have a very sophisticated way of looking at strategy. And they understand that if we stand firm over Ukraine, that's not just dealing with the problem of Mr. Putin, it's also a deterrent signal to them. And so it was something of a surprise to many of us to hear that our Foreign Secretary thought that perhaps we would be sending weapons to Taiwan. We may well in due course, but the point about all this is that the linkage between what happens to Ukraine and what happens to global security is now plain for all to see.
Gwydion, thank you ever so much. That's all we've got time for with you today, but we love having you on the show, so do join us again in the future. Gwydion Prince there, who's a former advisor to the Ministry of Defence and to NATO. Well, joining me now is Dr. Alan Mendoza. He's Executive Director at the Henry Jackson Society, a transatlantic foreign policy and security think tank. Alan, great to have you back on as well. It's interesting that even Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been talking about this war in Ukraine representing a potential shift to a new world order. China's name being mentioned. We're seeing NATO expanding with Sweden and Finland joining the club. Is this going to be enough to tilt things back in the favour of the West, or is the West, when it comes to economic and military might, in a sort of inevitable decline?
Well, it's not an inevitable decline. You're in decline if you choose to be in decline on these sort of issues. And NATO is showing it's choosing not to be in decline. On the contrary, it's choosing to be vigorous. It's choosing to be expansionist in the sense of, allowing others to join it if it wants to. It is still a defensive alliance, let's not forget. It's not targeted at others, but it is there to defend its members against external threats, of which Russia is clearly the most obvious one in this regard. It will need more money to fund that, and people have to be serious about that. There have been commitments to move that forward, but we do need to accept that it will cost more to defend ourselves, because the world, unfortunately, is a more dangerous place than what it was even 5 years ago.
What strikes me as something that hasn't been talked about a lot in recent weeks is the fact that when we look at the history of how Russia's been able to build up power and influence and leverage now threats across the whole world, it's come through a huge amount of trade, whether that is in grain, whether that is in fertiliser, whether that is in energy, and he's able to precipitate crises in all those sectors. Are we not facing the same issue when it comes to China, whose might is being expanded through the Belt and Road Initiative? And the UK, for example, has doubled its trade with Beijing in the last decade. Is that something we need to be looking at very closely, rather than just expanding NATO?
Absolutely. We produced a paper here a couple of years back looking at strategic dependency of the Five Eyes countries on China. And we discovered that in key sectors, key areas, whether it is in health or whether it is in food supply or others, we are heavily dependent on China as a supplier. And that's a problem because, of course, as we've seen in the Russian context, if you are strategically dependent on a country for something that you absolutely need to have, that creates enormous sort of problems for you should you end up in an argument with that country. And what we suggested at the time was that we should use this period right now when we're not in active conflict with China, knowing that China is indeed a competitor rather than a friend, and potentially itself is flouting international law and seeks to do the same perhaps going forwards, that we should use this opportunity to divest, if you like, from Chinese supply in key areas and either create our own or go to other sources that are not going to be in competition with the UK national interests. And that's something that absolutely has to happen today.
And what is the significance, therefore, of China's near neighbour Japan being in attendance at the NATO summit?
Well, I think the key to this is obviously people understanding that the threats to the free world are coming from two main sources. We've got the Russian threat, obviously. The second one is China. There are other sources as well. North Korea is a problem. Iran is a problem. But these are of second order compared, of course, to the enormous damage that China and Russia can cause as competitors to the free world. These are unfree nations with autocratic systems of government who, it appears, are happy to flout international laws and break them willy-nilly in order to get what they want. That is not something that the neighbours of either find attractive or interesting, and that is why I think we're trying to expand the free world space, if you like, to accommodate all those democracies who wish to stand with us in defence of the international rules-based order.
Dr. Alan Mendoza, fantastic to have you back on the programme. Dr. Alan Mendoza and Henry Jackson Society. Well, my studio guest today is former writer and Labour Party advisor Scarlett Maguire. It's interesting. I've been sort of quite interested in the geopolitical shifts of sand over the previous decades, but it does seem to me that if we're too clunky about this, it actually looks a bit like we're trying to create a Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, also, it seems the problem of taking on China and Russia at the same time is quite difficult because if we remember, Russia deliberately didn't go into Ukraine till after the winter, the Chinese Olympics were over. They're too close. What we need to do is we need to divide them, not take on both of them. And we are clunking. I mean, the other thing that really worries me is we're not being quite honest about what we're trying to do. I mean, are we seriously going to start taking on Russia? In that case, we need to know what we're doing instead of doing it sort of little by little. And the rhetoric, Russia can't win. It seems to me that nobody can win in Ukraine, actually, let alone the Ukrainians. I mean, Russia is destroying it. They're destroying it is just terrible. And we need to think, what is the end game? Is the end game really we think we're going to beat Russia?
Yeah, no, I'm tragically coming to the same conclusion as you, actually, Scarlett. Thank you ever so much for your thoughts. You're at GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, America has announced that it plans to boost its military presence across Europe. I'll be discussing just that with John Bolton, former security advisor to President Trump. Time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGiven from the Met Office. There is some brighter weather out there this afternoon, but rain or showers are affecting many places, and it is on the cool side. Temperatures a little below average for the time of year. Low pressure towards the northwest at the moment, and really that's how things are shaping up through the next few days into the weekend before it looks like improvements are on the way for next week. But for the time being, that low is driving a lot of clouds, some showers, and even some longer spells of rain in. So during the evening, we're expecting some wetter weather for a time in the far south and southeast of England, that moving up through East Anglia and perhaps edging into North Sea coasts. Equally, there'll be some showers moving through southwest England, Wales, into Northern Ireland and Northern England as well as Scotland later. But away from the showers overnight, with some clear spells, temperatures will dip into the low double figures, I should say. A rain warning in force first thing for Northern Ireland because of some slow-moving outbreaks of rain. 20 to 30 millimetres could cause some localised flooding. But otherwise, for much of the UK, it's more of the same. Sunny spells, heavy showers, and in the south, perhaps some rumbles of thunder and the odd hail shower. On the cool side, once again, 18 to 22 Celsius typically up and down the country, and it's going to feel cool with a fresh breeze down towards the southwest. Now into Thursday evening, the showers continue for some time. Eventually, clearer spells will break out here and there. And it looks like for many it's a dry start to Friday at least, with some brighter spells first thing. But again, it's on the cool side. Temperatures holding up at 11 or 13 Celsius in main urban areas, but in the single figures in the countryside. Friday morning then starts off with some sunshine. Increasingly, showers will build, initially western coasts and then more widely through the day. And Friday is another showery day as well as Saturday, but things do dry up by Sunday.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
A special delivery from the Special Relationship. America is increasing military deployments to Europe in a bid to show unshakable alliance within NATO, including a permanent headquarters for the US Army in Poland, on the doorstep of Russia. Troops, aircraft, air defence systems and naval destroyers all crossing the Atlantic to bolster the West. The commitment of the Anglosphere in defending Western interests is rarely called into question. The US and UK have famously stood shoulder to shoulder since Reagan and Thatcher, Bush and Blair. The problem, it seems, is Western Europe, not the Baltic states, who know what it is to be under the thumb of the USSR, not the Nordic countries, whose territories have long been stalked by the Russian bear, but the self-appointed leaders of Europe, all too often blinded by naive capitalism, gobbling up Russian energy and Chinese yuan, snootily dismissing Donald Trump 4 years ago when he warned by Russia. History has a funny way of repeating itself, and as war erupts in Europe once again, it's the UK and the US ready to fight back. I'm joined now by John Bolter, former United States ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor to President Trump. John, it's brilliant having you back on the programme. How pertinent and how prescient that you worked for Donald Trump, who called this out 4 years ago and said of Germany, you are under the thumb of Putin if you continue buying his energy. And his comments were dismissed. They heaved, they sighed, they rolled their eyes. If only they had listened.
Right. Well, it's too bad they actually didn't listen to Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s, because he warned Europe that dependence on Russian oil and gas would come at a high price. And I think despite a lot of rhetoric from NATO leaders about the unity of the alliance and the effectiveness of the sanctions, that's really not borne out in practice. There's no evidence that Russia's conduct of the war in Ukraine has been significantly affected. I do think we're imposing costs on Russia, to be sure, but the weakness, the ineffectiveness, the disparity in the sanctions really has given much more than a loophole to the Russians to be able to continue and sustain the war. And I hope this NATO summit will help close some of those gaps, but I'm skeptical.
If certain European countries had acted harder and faster, do you think it would have been enough to push Putin back?
Well, I think the main failure of the alliance, and I would say this is an American failure above all, was to fail to deter the invasion to begin with. You know, many people were saying that we should have been imposing sanctions on Russia well before February the 24th. And there's a very good reason for that, because the West as a whole did not react adequately to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and certainly didn't react other than with rhetoric to the troop buildup that was visible to all to see along the Russian-Ukraine border. People said, well, my goodness, if you impose sanctions before Russia invades, that'll just speed the invasion up. Well, look at what actually happened. And this is a complicated subject, but basically our deterrence efforts failed, and that's why we see this grinding war underway now with no real end in sight, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because my next question is that, you know, the US is sending military hardware and troops to Europe now, and quite a significant amount too. But is this perhaps a sad realization that Ukraine is a lost cause and we're scrambling now to protect our own territories?
Well, I hope it's not a lost cause, but it does reflect, again, another NATO failure, and I think the U.S. bears responsibility. When NATO took in the Eastern and Central European countries, formerly parts of the Warsaw Pact, and in the case of the Baltics, part of the Soviet Union itself, it never made a clear strategic decision where it was going to stop the expansion. So it left a gray zone in which we see Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and Eastern Europe, others in the Caucasus, others in Central Asia. And that gray zone really was an invitation for Russian mischief. And that's what we've seen. I just would remind everybody that President George W. Bush proposed in April of 2008 to bring Georgia and Ukraine into a fast track for NATO membership, and the French and the Germans rejected it. Why Sweden and Finland want to come into NATO now? Because they know neither the Russians nor back in Soviet days ever crossed a NATO border. That is the guarantee, and that guarantee, that possibility, was rejected by the Western Europeans in 2008.
Donald Trump, of course, famously talked tough on Russia and China, despite, ironically, of course, being constantly accused of having links with the Kremlin and then backing his election campaign. Is Biden following in his footsteps? Is the current president talking tough enough?
Well, I think he talks tough, but I think the question here is action. And right now in eastern Ukraine, we're in a race to see whether the additional weapon systems that are being provided by the U.S., by the UK, by some of the Eastern European countries, not so much by Germany and France, whether they can get to the Ukrainian front lines before Putin achieves whatever his current objectives are. And he says, okay, time for this war to be over. I'm stopping hostilities unilaterally, because if we allow that to happen at Putin's timetable, he may well have established a new boundary for Russia that would be very hard to roll back. That's why talk of negotiations with the Russians now is a big mistake. We have to keep the big picture in mind here. This was unprovoked aggression by Russia. If it has seemed to succeed in Ukraine, he may try it elsewhere. And certainly they're watching very closely in Beijing the failure of the West to stop the aggression.
John Bolton, a fascinating insight from you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. The former US ambassador to the UN and US National Security Advisor. Scott, I'm going to go back to you because something is dawning on me, and I don't always like to say it out loud, but I'm beginning to think it's time that the West stepped things up, even if it's perceived as aggressive, even if it's perceived as an escalation. I think we're being too reactive to Putin. What do you think?
Well, if you call stepping things up going into Ukraine, then Russia is at war with NATO, and there will be consequences, and there will be masses and masses of deaths, including the Ukrainians. I mean, the problem is that because John's right. We knew that Russia was there in early. People told me that they wouldn't go in until February or March because of that's when the ground was frozen, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what they did. and yet we weren't prepared for it. But now, what is our... It goes back to what is our end game? What are we trying to do? And he's absolutely right about China. I mean, you know, Ben Wallace was asked, will we defend Taiwan? On which he was basically silent. I mean, what are we going to... So it's really difficult until people start saying, OK, this is where we're going and this is what it means. And instead we have this, we love the Ukrainians, we're going to send them lots of things. But what does it... And I can understand the Ukrainians saying, we want more, we want more, we want more. But what does it really mean? I mean, how... And if we go in, then do we know what Putin's going to do? And then, you know, there is a serious problem with nuclear weapons. I mean, we do not know how paranoid and tyrannical Putin is.
What do you think? How paranoid is Putin? Are you scared of him and the rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin and nuclear threats? Should we somehow do more? I'm not saying we should go into Ukraine, but what would that more potentially be? Let me know. gbviews@gbnews.uk. You are with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, America has announced that it plans to boost its military presence across Russia. Well, I just did discuss that, so that isn't coming up. Time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News with the latest headlines. Right now, it is 2:33. NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision demonstrates the alliance's door remains open. He said NATO is being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
In Prime Minister's questions today, the Deputy Labour leader, Angela Rayner, challenged the government for losing 2 by-elections in one day last week, as she and the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, deputised in the Commons.
It's no wonder that the Prime Minister has fled the country and left the honourable member to carry the can. The people of Wakefield and Tiverton held their own vote of no confidence. The Prime Minister isn't just losing the room, Mr. Speaker, he's losing the country. But instead of showing some humility, he intends to limp on until the 2030s. So does he think the Cabinet will prop him up for this long?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady. I gently point out to her that we want this Prime Minister to go on a lot longer than she wants the leader of the Labour Party to go on.
A 29-year-old man has been remanded in custody after appearing in court, charged with the murder of Zara Alina. The aspiring lawyer, who was 35, died on Sunday after being found with serious head injuries in Ilford in East London. Jordan McSweeney has also been charged with attempted rape and robbery. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Shortly, we'll be back to Alex for We Need to Talk About.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
There was a febrile atmosphere 2 years ago when the imported BLM movement whipped up a frenzy of posturing and protests across Britain after the country, like many others, was shut down, atomised and locked in echo chambers as the pandemic struck. One outbreak of demonstration in Bristol saw the statue of slave trader Edward Colston torn down and dragged to Perrow's Bridge, where it was thrown into the harbour. The activists identified, known as the Colston Four, were found not guilty of criminal damage, despite acknowledging they had played a part. The defence argued that the act of toppling the statue of a prominent slave trader on whose ships tens of thousands of people had died was proportionate. Well, today, their acquittal could be overturned after the Attorney General referred it to the Court of Appeal. A symbolic moment, perhaps, for our legal system, trapped in a tug-of-war between the opposing sides of the so-called culture wars. Well, joining us from the Royal Courts of Justice is our Culture and Social Affairs editor, Inaya Folarin Iman. Inaya, what is the latest from that case?
So, as you mentioned in the introduction, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in June 2020, many protesters in Bristol gathered and toppled the statue of Edward Colston, the slave owner, and toppled it into Bristol Harbour. Now, many of those involved in the protests were charged with criminal damage, with 6 accepted a police caution. However, 4 were acquitted under a jury trial. Now, this caused a lot of controversy, and several of the arguments that were used by the defendants' lawyers. One was the fact that the campaigning to get the statue removed was unsuccessful, and Bristol's refusal to allow it to be removed effectively amounted to a hate crime. But also, they argue that, for example, rather than it cost the council the toppling, the value of the statue actually appreciated, it increased. And the third argument, and this is the one that caused a lot of contention, which is that essentially charging them with criminal damage would be disproportionate, as they were expressing their right to freedom of expression and the right to protest. Now, the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, took issue with this and said that the ruling could cause uncertainty when it came to protesters when they're accused of damage as part of a protest, and has referred this case to the Court of Appeal. However, there is a lot of pushback as well. Many people argue that the referral was politically motivated. Laura O'Brien, the solicitor that represented several of the Colston Four, called it political overreach, and that the Attorney General simply did not like the verdict that the jury had given. Also, she said that we have to understand the Attorney General's referral in the context of the government pushing back against the right to protest. But today we heard arguments from both sides, one arguing essentially that this could amount to a form of violence and actually violating an attack on the democratic principles, which is that actually if you have criminal damage, this does not violate your right to free speech if you are charged, or your right to freedom of protest. It is quite a clear-cut matter of criminal damage. Whereas the other side was effectively saying, well, no, it's not as simple as that. That, for example, the existence of the statue could be a form of expression itself, and that the Colston Four were responding to that using their own free speech. So many people have very strong views on multiple sides of the argument. Some people argue this is a clear-cut case of criminal damage, whereas other people say that actually this is a very specific matter in relation to Colston. That statue shouldn't be there. The protesters were doing the right thing.
Inaya, thank you ever so much for that update. Inaya Folarin Iman, GB News' very own. Well, Scarlett, I'm going to come to you because it was without doubt a symbolic moment during those BLM protests, but today is potentially a seminal moment when it comes to setting a legal precedent. What's your view?
I think it's really important to say that whatever happens, the not guilty verdicts stand. I mean, this is that it doesn't undo that. That what this is at the Court of Appeal are deciding legal things. I happen to think that Edward Colston, I mean, he wasn't just a slave trader, I mean, you know, making all his money out of misery. He was one of the worst slave traders. He branded his slaves, right? So he treated, I mean, they were to him cattle. And you can understand the fury of people in Bristol, where up until very recently, you had the Colston Hall, you had Colston Gardens, you had the statue. I mean, Colston was seen as almost, you know, the Lord Mayor of Bristol, which brought fury, and it had been going on. So I absolutely understand why and I'm sure that if I had been there, I would have been as furious as they were and brought it down. I mean, I think on the legal thing, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think one of the things that one distrusts Suella Braverman, who is the Attorney General, is that she brought it on the day that Boris Johnson got a fine. I mean, the whole thing smells of party politics.
But is there not a risk here that, as if it stands at the moment, that other people who are damaging things, whether they like it or not, whatever it represents, could say, well, it's my right to protest?
Yeah,
it becomes a moral decision, not a legal one.
Well, no, because on each one, it's a case by case, because it doesn't say. So if you throw red paint at the cenotaph, right, and you say, I'm against war, and legally you go, but the cenotaph is about peace. This has got nothing to do with it. This was just an excuse and it was bad. I mean, if you deface a statue of Winston Churchill and say, but he was a racist, then you have the argument. I mean, I think it's good that the arguments are had in court, actually. I think that that's what it is that you say, no, this is wrong, you can't do it, or yes, we understand. And I do think, I mean, you know, the problem is that bad cases make bad law. Colston was such a difficult case because he was, I mean, such a awful man. I mean, you know, and gave a legacy to Bristol that it really, I mean, a legacy that Bristol was built on slavery, really. And so you can understand that whole thing. It's not going to go on. I mean, all these cases where juries, and it was a jury who found it, right, that where juries go against the government, they are very few and far between.
Scarlett, thank you. Well, it's a spicy topic, so do let me know your thoughts. GBViews at gbnews.uk. Or you can tweet us at GBNews. Now, the country's police watchdog has put the nation's biggest police force, London's Metropolitan Police, under special measures, citing substantial and persistent concerns. From the shocking kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard by one of its own officers, the cruel photographs by the bodies of two female victims of a Satanist murderer shared in a police WhatsApp group with derogatory and sexist language, the strip search of 3 young schoolgirls alongside a large backlog of child abuse cases, and with widespread accusations of misogyny, well, they've been put down in part to a young and inexperienced workforce. What it shows is that what should be revered and trusted is in the grip of a dangerously declining culture. Its well-known head, Dame Cressida Dick, was forced to quit after losing the backing of the London mayor. And while the police inspector did not dispute the force's capabilities nor the major challenges it routinely deals with, It is clear to me something far more pernicious is rotting the Met from within. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, is at Scotland Yard. Mark, how significant is this?
Well, it's certainly claimed that there is a failure of leadership from the top down. And of course, Dame Cressida Dick, as you mentioned there in your introduction, was forced to resign effectively by the London Mayor Sadiq Khan in February after this litany of failures and embarrassing episodes for the Metropolitan Police. But I think those individual officers and staff at Scotland Yard and throughout the Metropolitan Police Force area, seeing that this force, the country's biggest force, has now been placed in special measures, they will be, I think, deeply disheartened by that and disillusioned by what has happened, because they're out there every day on the front line trying to do their best for the people of the capital and beyond. This is the country's biggest police force, but it has national remit on issues like counter-terrorism policing and, of course, royal protection and many other areas that will be affected or felt by the country as a whole. So it is a serious issue. What these special measures mean is that there will have to be a plan of action now put in place by the force to try to improve. They can get some help from the likes of the National Police Chiefs Council and the National College of Policing as well. But there will be intense eyes going forward on the Metropolitan Police, and at a time, of course, when they don't have a new commissioner, and we've already got a row brewing again today after the policing minister, Kit Malthouse, in the House of Commons, talking about the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, who's effectively, of course, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, saying that he is distancing himself from the force and that he needs to assume a leadership role and really bring about these changes. Sadiq Khan, in effectively sacking Dame Cressida Dick, does put himself in a vulnerable position, especially when we're at a stage now where there is no new Metropolitan Police Commissioner. It's down to a short list of two, Sir Mark Rowley and also Nick F. Grave, an Assistant Commissioner within the Metropolitan Police, but as yet no Commissioner, no one to take charge at the helm other than the Acting Commissioner, Sir Stephen Howes, at the moment.
Mark, thank you ever so much. Mark White there, our Home and Security editor. Well, joining me now on the show is Graham Whettone, who's a former Met Police officer and author. Graham, fantastic to have you on. Now, every time the police get in trouble, what we tend to hear is it's funding, it's cuts. But this seems to me like an issue of culture. What is going on?
I don't think it's culture, and sadly, it is. You take it back to the cause. The cause is funding and cuts. It goes back 10 or 12 years. No surprise that we're at this stage now. You mentioned, I think in one of your intros, largely inexperienced workforce. That comes from the cuts from 10 or 12 years ago when 20,000 officers were cut, the numbers were cut. There's now a big uplift programme to recruit people. You cannot put 20,000 back into a workforce and expect them to be experienced in policing. Policing takes time to know what you are doing and to learn your job, learn your role and carry it out effectively and professionally.
Most human beings know that taking photographs of dead bodies and laughing about them on a WhatsApp group, or kidnapping and murdering someone, or strip searching a minor female is just plain wrong. I mean, that is not about funding and that is not about cuts. Is there not a culture problem as well?
No, I don't think there is a cut. I mean, you talk about a culture. The culture within policing is to prevent crime, detect crime. That's the culture for the majority, the vast majority of officers. There are, and it is, as Mark mentioned, there's been a litany of incidents, as you've mentioned, that the behaviour has been absolutely appalling from serving police officers. But again, it's been investigated by the Met. They've been identified and dismissed and imprisoned on those incidents. So the Met are working to root out those individuals that are bringing discredit on the service. The vast majority of officers are going to work. I'm just concerned that put them into special measures will again demoralise the workforce even further. They need some urgent measures put in place to bring us back to basic policing, to proactively police, to prevent crime, detect crime, and they need some effective supervision on the front line.
Graham, thank you ever so much. It's fantastic to have your insight. Graham Whettone there, who's a former Met officer and author. Now, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are among those who've been paying tributes to Dame Deborah James, also known as Bowel Babe, who died at the age of 40 after battling bowel cancer since 2016. The podcaster and campaigner raised millions of pounds for charity during her battle against the disease. Well, joining me now is writer and former Labour Party advisor Scarlett Maguire. Now, Scarlett, I know you really wanted to talk about this, didn't you?
Yeah, look, what she did was completely brilliant, and it was brilliant for two reasons. One is she gave hope to a lot of people with cancer, and she showed that just because you have cancer, you don't have to be a victim. And she, as your news said, I mean, she got people who were worried about it, and she saved lives. And she also saved lives by raising over £6 million to research, because that's what's made the enormous difference to cancer is the research, which has just turned it around. I want to talk about it because I've got breast cancer, and I'm perfectly normal. I think it's really important to say.
You're perfectly wonderful.
And so first of all, it was detected in a mammogram. I was completely healthy. I mean, I have to say, by and large, I feel completely healthy. And it was detected early, and it should have just been a simple operation, bit of radiography, over in 6 weeks. Unfortunately, I was, as a friend put it, the 1%. 99% of women who have what I had, that's what it is. My cancer was different. It was, as they say, uncommon, not rare. And so I'm going through chemotherapy. And it's really important to say chemotherapy is not as bad as everybody thinks. Not pleasant, but actually, as I showed, I can live a perfectly normal life. I get exhausted. I had chemo yesterday, and I came in today, and I've been working before this programme. Now, this is a wig. The hair has gone, and there are unpleasant side effects. But I just want to say to people, if you're worried about it, go for it. And the treatment really isn't that bad. And the earlier you get it, the more minor the treatment is. And then, even with all of mine, and I'm going to have a breast taken off, and then I'm going to have radiography. I look forward to a lot this year. At the end of the year, it should be over, completely cured, right? And that most people are lucky enough, if you get grade 1 and 2, it'll all be over. And so it's really worth going to see it, right? Even 3 and 4, they can keep you alive for years, and all the research keeps you alive for longer. So I think it's brilliant. But Deborah James is just the only thing about her is she always looked happy. And can I say that sometimes you're allowed to say it's shit?
Sorry, Ofcom.
Sorry. Yes, it is not very pleasant. It is really nasty.
We're talking about that, the word that you just said, fecal matter. What Deborah did, of course, was break taboo on this and actually talk about poo. How important is that when it comes to cancer and, you know, issues with the body, to get people in front of doctors earlier and to share their experiences with other people like you are today?
Oh, no, it's really important. If you have a problem, I mean, you know, if you're having masses of diarrhoea or you're having bleeding, go to a doctor, because actually we're really lucky enough. If you see a doctor and they put you on within 2 weeks, you will be seen in a hospital. You'll have a colonoscopy. Not really pleasant, but again, bearable, and they'll find out if there's something wrong with you. So however embarrassing it is, go to your doctor, say I'm worried, and they'll do something.
Scarlett, thank you so much. A very fitting tribute from another remarkable woman. I always love having you on the show, and it's been a pleasure to have your company today, and I'm so proud of you. I mean, you are showing everybody that you can have chemo and come and do GB News, amongst other things. And we're very grateful to have had you here today. Scarlett Maguire, thank you ever so much. Well, that is about it for me for today. Join me again for We Need to Talk About on GB News at the same time, 2 o'clock tomorrow. Coming up next, it's The Briefing, this time with Tom Harwood, because our Darren is over in Madrid. First, though, it's time for a check on the weather forecast, and there's been change afoot in many parts of the country, so fingers crossed. I've enjoyed your company today, as I've enjoyed Scarlett Maguire's, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. But for now, bye-bye.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. There is some brighter weather out there this afternoon, but rain or showers are affecting many places, and it is on the cool side. Temperatures a little below average for the time of year. Low pressure towards the northwest at the moment, and really that's how things are shaping up through the next few days into the weekend before it looks like improvements are on the way for next week. But for the time being, that low is driving a lot of clouds, some showers, and even some longer spells of rain in. So during the evening, we're expecting some wetter weather for a time in the far south and southeast of England, that moving up through East Anglia and perhaps edging into North Sea coasts. Equally, there'll be some showers moving through southwest England, Wales, into Northern Ireland and Northern England as well as Scotland later. But away from the showers overnight, with some clear spells, temperatures will dip into the low double figures, I should say. A rain warning in force first thing for Northern Ireland because of